Well, welcome to our discussion about is drinking water at risk. I'm the president of the Royal Canadian Institute for Science. My name is Hella Toussaint, and we are a not-for-profit. We're 165 years old. Sir Sandford Fleming, who conceived of the idea of time zones, started in 1849 with the idea that it would be good to have scientists come out and speak to the public. The idea of you walking around scientists' halls and popping in and asking them what they were doing, he thought was better if to bring the science out. So the Royal Canadian Institute for Science has been doing this for 165 years. But this is our first experiment across Canada. We're going to be doing talks with the same topic, is our drinking water at risk, with this launch here in Ottawa, and then moving to Calgary and finally end up in Vancouver. So the talks are being recorded and we put them onto our website and their podcasts, so you can also watch them there. During a normal year, we have science speakers in Toronto, and all those webcasts are up, and the topics range all the way from biology to physics, astronomy, right across the spectrum of science. So you might find something interesting on there. So our vision is an informed public that embraces science to build a stronger Canada. It's consistent with what Sir Sandford Fleming thought about 165 years ago. And ours is a platform of public engagement, and that's what we're doing here with leading scientists, and we have 4 of them. The idea is to get science dialogue going. The dialogue with the scientists will actually happen after this talk over a cash bar with popcorn and chips, so you can get up close and personal with scientists as well. Our partnership is with the David Suzuki Foundation, who also have education as one of their thrusts. So we're working with the David Suzuki Foundation on this series across Canada. So this topic of is our drinking water at risk? Why did we choose this? So in reading probably literature that you've seen as well, of the Earth's water, less than 3% of it is fresh. And most of that's trapped in glacial ice or in the soil, and that leaves less than 1% available for human use. Canadians are the second biggest users of fresh water in the world. We use 329 liters a day, every day, of fresh drinking water, so you can imagine that. Over the past year, we've seen all of the flooding in Calgary. There's a drought in California right now, all affecting how much fresh water is available for us. So we thought that to begin the dialogue on drinking water being at risk is important. And so tonight we're going to bring you 4 different perspectives of this. So our panelists represent the fields of science policy, chemistry, engineering, and human behavior. They're going to be presenting questions such as the soft path, which tackles the broad question asking not only how to use water more efficiently, but in some cases, why use water at all? And if we're taking it, we're also drinking it, and painkillers, blood thinners, hormones, cocaine, chemotherapy agents, whatever goes into us comes out of us, and through our own biological effluent, every time we flush the toilet, the excreted drugs pass through most sewage treatment processes and end up in rivers and lakes and then in our drinking water. So these are ideas of very big concern, and what our idea is to bring the scientists to you, and you can form your opinion after hearing about them as to whether our drinking water is at risk. So to moderate our panel, we're really pleased to have Neal here from the CBC. So I drive to Ottawa to visit my daughter and son-in-law, and I'm always listening to him in the afternoon from 3 to 6 on CBC, and I thought, who better to moderate this panel discussion? So as you probably know, he's the host of All in a Day, and in addition to that, he's now a published author. He released his very first children's book, Ava and the Little Folk, in 2012. He's an accomplished playwright, stage director, and occasional performer. So I'm really pleased to introduce Alan to moderate our distinguished panel.
Thank you so much. Actually think there's a missed fundraising opportunity there. You could have just said, is our drinking water at risk? Yes, cash bar in lobby, and send people directly out there. It actually is a very good example of how we often do science journalism, which is Are you all going to die? Stay tuned, and we'll tell you, or we'll tell you how not to die. Stay tuned. It was a pleasure having on All in a Day a little bit earlier today, Banu Ormeci and Chris Metcalfe on the show, is doing a little bit of a preview. We received after that an email. We got several emails from people just saying how enthralled they were with both of them on the program. But there was one that came in from Kingston, from Queens, in fact, saying, Alan, you have set yourself up to be targeted now by the government. After all, what do mere scientists, as opposed to politicians, know about water quality? So when Hella talks about this idea of being able to get out and talk to scientists and hear their opinions, sometimes it is becoming harder and harder to do. So I appreciate the opportunity to do that here too. So without further ado, I'm going to be bringing up the panelists one by one, and then we'll do a little bit of a chat after that. So first up, a natural resource economist whose main interests lie in the ways that environmental protection is connected to the use of minerals, energy, and water. He is involved with the Polis Project for Ecological Governance. He's worked with Energy Probe, Friends of the Earth, and many publications to his credit, including Making the Most of the Water We Have, the Soft Path Approach to Water Management. Please welcome Dr. David Brooks.
Thank you, Alan. I have only 10 or 12 minutes, and being perhaps foolish, I'm dividing my talk into two parts because I want to get two things across. The first part is about the human right to water, which is a subject that comes up over and over again. The second part is how to make that right effective with a new analytical technique. Now, it seems obvious that there's a human right to water, and that's part of the problem. Too much of the commentary on a human right to water is trivial. That is, it belabors the obvious and ignores anything that's difficult. And this combination of simplicity and complexity is typical of water. And to jump a little bit away from science, Gwendolyn McEwen, a Canadian poet, captured this in a single sentence, something she wrote 32 years ago. Water has no conscience and no shame. Well, let me see if I can untangle some of that complexity a little bit. First, there is a human right to water, but it only applies to that quantity of water that we use directly for ourselves, for drinking, for cooking, and for certain kinds of sanitation. That's a very important part of our use of water, but it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the world's water use. Second, in almost every country, and Canada's a major exception, but it's in almost every country, the lion's share of water is used for irrigating crops. At least 80% of the world's water, of the human use of water, is to make money. And I think it's obvious that there is no human right to profits. Third, water scarcity is a global problem, but the main problem is not lack of water, but poor management of water. To quote from a recent Human Development Report, there is more than enough water in the world for domestic purposes, for agriculture, and for industry. Scarcity is manufactured through political processes and institutions that disadvantage the poor. Fourth, getting back to complexity, it is not at all easy, even for households, to define how much water should be included in the notion of a right. For example, gardens are mainly a hobby in Canada, but they are an essential part of nutrition for developing countries. And if there's a human right to water, it must be affordable, which does not necessarily mean that it should be free, but appropriate pricing of water is a subject that would take the entire evening and then not be satisfied. So whatever the definition, many governments still fail miserably in supporting that right, particularly for vulnerable people in society. And think of Canada in think of Canada's failures in First Nations communities. However, most governments do agree that the human right does exist, and many act as if that right exists. The right is not found, for the most part, in hard statutes, laws. It's found in what's called soft law. That is, people have acted as if there's a right, so it becomes a right simply because of what's happened. Governments that ignore soft law giving a human right to water would not likely agree, even if there was hard law, even if there were statutes, they'd probably just ignore them. So, to conclude the first part of my talk, we have to recognize that there are many ways in which human rights to water can be made effective. And as long as the results are achieved, there is no reason to expect or demand identical methods in different nations with different ecologies, different traditions, and different government structures. So let's move to the second part, which involves what's called the soft path for water, which offers a new way to design water policy. The second part of my talk complements the first. If we are going to grant a human right to water, and indeed provide enough water for a high quality of life, we're going to have to manage water very differently in the future than we manage it today. The following slides summarize roughly 10 years of conceptual and analytical work on the potential for a water soft path in Canada. And let me make two other preliminary comments before we get to the slides. First, Canada is the leading country in the world studying water soft paths. And we're kind of proud of that, to be ahead of everyone else talking about water. It's being done here in small ways, but analytically, I think we're way ahead of anyone else. And second, I want to emphasize that the potential for water soft paths is measured quantitatively, with numbers. It is not just what one of my colleagues in that book that Alan mentioned, he likes to refer to eco-dreaming. Well, I guess it's eco-dreaming too, but it's also very carefully measured. So, let's see, does this work here or page? Oh, that one. Oh, not just that? Okay. This is the vision, and it applies not just to water, it applies to energy, applies to a lot of other things that we try to do. We've got to figure out ways to do things with less rather than with more. Okay. There are four distinguishing principles that basically turn current water management policies, the ways you get there, upside down. For the most part, we don't want water, we want a service. We want something that water can do for us. Perhaps the easiest example is cooling. We can cool things by many different ways. Water is a particularly cheap and effective way to do it, but it's not the only one. We don't want the water, we want the service of cooling. And you can go through then every other use of water, with the exception of those small quantities that we need for drinking. Those are separate, and then in that case the water's an end. You start making ecological security an absolute criterion. Typically, if you see natural resource policy, you'll go through the techniques, the measurements, the opportunity. Here's what we propose to do, and then you look at the ecological effects. No way. You've got to do it the other way around. The ecological security is an absolute criterion that we need right from the start. Water comes in various qualities, as does energy, as does most other things. There's no reason, it is just ecological and thermodynamic insanity to take water, bring it out of a source, treat it, run it to your house, and then use it to flush toilets. We can do a lot better than that, and there are many ways in doing that. Again, I'm skipping over all of this because each of these could take quite a bit of time. But And, for heaven's sakes, don't project forward and then see what you need. You'll get just a greater reflection of what you have now. What you've got to do is design that future that we want and then see how to get there. And that's the toughest part because, again, you can't eco-dream. You've got to connect what we have in the future, what we want in the future, to what we have now. And that can take a lot of time and a lot of analytics. Why a soft path? I'll go through this pretty quickly. You don't need me to tell you these things. Asking why rather than how is a very different way that compared with how we normally ask. We ask, how can we do this with less energy? Why are we using water at all? Something that Ella mentioned right from the start. And we're trying to work with nature rather than against it, and water treatment is why put a lot of chemicals, further new chemicals into the water? Why not see how water just cleans itself and use that? Now, these are the selected results from the first National Water Soft Path Study. And again, you can read these. If you want to talk about the second one, ask Paul, because he was the leader of that part of the team. I've highlighted the one about urban use, because that's really what's on the table today. Most of the drinking water does occur in urban areas. This was perhaps the most surprising result we found. We were amazed at just by adding one technique onto another technique, making sure they were feasible, making sure they were reasonably acceptable. And so when you take a 45% drop and a 50% growth, you can multiply those two and see where you're coming at. And these others then. The soft path is not free of changes in habits. The last one will show one of the options for changing habits. If you can get people to eat less meat, you can move the water use down in most cases. And just a final slide, just to say where we are. Water soft paths show, they chart a way. It's a defined way that will get you to consumption of water. Then let me ask, is anybody doing this? Well, nobody has come up and given us medals and said, you guys have found the way, but a number of communities are trying it, particularly communities that are faced with a major investment to maintain their water systems. When they're faced with a big expenditure, then water soft paths start to look very good because they are much cheaper to run and much lower investment cost. And I'd better stop there or I'll be impinging on my colleagues' time.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I think I felt sort of the sigh of relief in the room the first time that he actually sipped from the water glass because everybody was waiting to see whether it would be an Aaron Brockovich moment or not. But next up, Professor and Chair of the Environmental and Resource Studies and Director for Watershed Science at Trent University. A guy who has... Wait, I just realized, am I on the right one? Yes? Okay, good. If not, you're just going to have to deal with the next part of research. Focused his research over the past 18 years on the environmental distribution and toxic effects of organic contaminants, and is still looking today at how we flush everything from the pharmaceutical and personal care products in our home into the water systems. As he was mentioning when he was talking to me earlier today, that includes your deodorant, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome Dr. Chris Metcalfe.
We'll work out the logistics here on the technology first. No. There we go. You can help me just... I'll just hear it. Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Alan, for the introduction, and also thanks to the Royal Canadian Institute for the invitation to speak here today. and participate in the panel discussions. So we're going to switch up a little bit from talking about water quantity to water quality. And basically what I want to talk about is whether pharmaceuticals, personal care products, and other chemicals that we flush down the drain, I call them down the drain chemicals, could end up in our drinking water. And by the end of it, I think I'll be able to convince you that they are. Whether we should be concerned about them is the other issue. So, as was mentioned, we tend to flush down the drain a whole variety of different kinds of chemicals. So, the chemicals that are in deodorants, in hair shampoos, in our toothpaste, mouthwash, antibacterial soaps, in the detergents that we use in our homes, all go down the drain when we have a shower, or when we wash our hands, etc., or when we wash the dishes. And of course, anything that we take orally tends to pass through our bodies. And as a matter of fact, pharmaceuticals, between 70 and 90% of the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals we excrete. And of course, when we flush the toilet, they wind up going down the drain as well. So there's a variety of things, including illicit drugs as well, that are excreted into our wastewater treatment systems. So the question is then, what happens in the wastewater treatment plant? Well, basically, now Banu might give you a little bit more information about this than I, but basically what a wastewater treatment does is it separates out the solid bits from the aqueous bits. So through a process of treatment, you get the aqueous part of the wastewater being discharged into the environment, into receiving waters, and the solids, which are retained. And what we do in Ontario with about 30 to 40% of those solids is we apply them onto agricultural land as soil amendment. So we have to be concerned with some of these chemicals that wind up being discharged into receiving waters, and those that also make their way onto agricultural land, which I won't talk about. So by receiving waters, what are we referring to? Well, any lakes, rivers, and streams in which you have discharges of wastewater from treatment plants. And where we're concerned about the potential for chemical contaminants reaching fairly high concentrations is in those situations where you have high discharges from very large cities, you have multiple sources, multiple cities or municipalities which are all discharging into the same receiving water. And potentially during low flow periods, there would be less dilution, and so the concentrations of these chemicals might be higher than they would be during high flow periods. So there's an example here. This is the city of Edmonton which discharges its wastewater into the North Saskatchewan River. And during periods in the summer, which you see here, you actually can have very low dilution of the chemicals which are discharged along with that wastewater. So we tend to think in Canada that we have large amounts of fresh water. Do we really have to be concerned about the potential for contamination of drinking water here in Canada? So here's an example of a place where really the water resources are under stress. This is the Grand River watershed in southern Ontario. As you can see, several of the important cities in southern Ontario, including Guelph, Waterloo, Kitchener, etc., are located in this watershed. And each one of these yellow squares represents a wastewater treatment plant, which is discharging into the Grand River system. And the size of the square gives you an indication of the total volume which is being discharged. At the same time, there are 15 communities which are withdrawing water from the Grand River system to be used at least partially as a source of drinking water. So you've got about 1 million inhabitants in this really fairly small watershed, and there's multiple uses. In addition, there's agricultural runoff, which is occurring particularly in the upper parts of the watershed. So I would suggest that this would be an example of a particularly stressed kind of environment where you have the potential for chemicals which are present or being discharged in wastewater to make their way into drinking water treatment plants. So the example I want to talk to you about is the discharge from the city of Waterloo, and we sampled downstream of that discharge from the city of Waterloo into a drinking water treatment plant 17 kilometers downstream. And what we analyzed was a variety of antidepressant compounds. And I'm sorry, I'm a scientist, I gotta have graphs. I get a little twitchy when I don't have actual data to show here, so you're gonna have to bear with me. I'll try to make it as understandable as possible. So all these bars here represent different types of antidepressants that we detected in the Grand River system. And as you can see, we detected these compounds, albeit in lower concentration, 17 kilometers downstream, and that just happened to be at the intake for a drinking water treatment plant. Another group of compounds that we've been looking at as a tracer of contamination from wastewater are artificial sweeteners. They're perfect for this kind of source evaluation because artificial sweeteners go right through us. We don't utilize them for anything. That's why they're used as artificial sweeteners. We don't obtain any caloric benefit from them whatsoever. And a couple of these compounds are very persistent. So the two that we've been looking at are sucralose and acesulfame. And they are very persistent, not only in us, but in the environment. And we can use them as tracers of contamination downstream of wastewater treatment plants. So a few years ago, actually in a project that we did with the support from the Ontario Ministry of Environment, we looked at a range of these chemicals, including artificial sweeteners, in drinking water in 5 different communities. Number one is the city of Ottawa, so we sampled in your drinking water treatment plant, and we also sampled in Kingston, number 2, and at 3 different communities in the Grand River. The 5th community was in the First Nations community of Oswego, or Six Nations. So we were particularly interested to see what the data showed there. And again, sorry to show you these graphs, but what you're looking at here is different sampling points where we looked at the raw or untreated drinking water and the treated drinking water at 3 different sampling periods. The good news, as far as you should be concerned, is that the drinking water in Ottawa showed relatively low concentrations of sucralose, one of those artificial sweeteners, and there was some removal as a result of the treatment. But you can see in drinking water treatment plant number 3 and number 5, which are both in the Grand River system, that you had relatively high concentrations of that tracer of wastewater, both in the raw and the treated drinking water. So these chemicals are making their way into drinking water, and they are persisting through the treatment process. So the take-home message is that we have both aquatic organisms being exposed to this cocktail of chemicals, but also potentially we're being exposed as a result of our intake of drinking water. So should we be concerned about potential health effects? And I've tried to illustrate this by comparing the prescribed daily dose of 3 different drugs. Ethinyl estradiol, which is the drug that's in the birth control pill, diazepam, which is the drug in Valium, and ibuprofen, which is in your your bathroom cabinet as Advil. And what I'm comparing in the light blue here is the amount that you would take in a daily dose if you were to consume 2 liters of contaminated water a day. This is contaminated at the maximum kinds of concentrations that you would find in drinking water. And the dark blue bar is the prescribed dose that you would take if you were taking the birth control pill or you were taking Valium for an anxiety disorder, etc. And it's a log scale here on the left, so you can see that there's a big difference between the prescribed dose and the amount that you would take in if you were consuming these drugs on a daily basis at 2 liters a day. So maybe we shouldn't be concerned. However, we're not taking into account a few things here. One is that we're not really considering the adverse effects of mixtures of drugs. We don't consume one drug in our drinking water, it's a whole mixture of them. So you could have many different antidepressants which cumulatively could have an effect. The other thing that you have to be concerned about is that you can get disinfection byproducts. So when you chlorinate your drinking water, for instance, you could have formation of byproducts which are potentially toxic. And then finally, these drugs are targeted for specific segments of the community. So, for instance, if you were taking a drug that was meant to lower blood cholesterol, that would be for individuals, typically older individuals that have high cholesterol. They're not for children to take. They're not for pregnant women to take. So we don't really know what the potential effects might be, even at very low doses. So I rather like the quotation from Alan Jones. He's a UK researcher, came up with a few years ago, which is basically saying, we don't think that the issue is an extreme hazard, but if we can take measures to reduce the exposure to these chemicals, then why not do it? So what can we do as John Q. citizen in order to try to address these problems? Well, we can make smart consumer decisions around the products that contain contaminants of emerging concern. So I know, for instance, the David Suzuki Foundation does an awful lot of advocacy about consumers making smart choices to choose personal care products that aren't potentially harmful. And we don't want to wind up in receiving waters. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing that we can do is invest in better technologies, not only for removing these things from wastewater treatment plants, but also removing them once they get into our drinking water treatment plants. And with that segue, hopefully I've set things up for Banu to talk about that subject. So thank you for your time, and hopefully we can chat later.
I did the worst bit of self-promotion there, and CBC will fire me if I don't say that if you want to hear more from Chris Metcalfe and Banu Ormeci, you can hear their interview on All in a Day on cbc.ca/allinaday. It is up there. When you're not listening to us on 91.5 FM in Ottawa, Gatineau, 107.5. Okay, stop. Next up, a woman who I was thrilled to see at the TEDx talk. I'm trying to think of how many years ago that was now, a few back. And I remember I came into work the next day and I said, I know who we should always have on the radio all the time. It's Banu Ormeci, professor in Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carleton, Canada Research Chair in Wastewater Treatment Engineering. She takes a look at water and wastewater disinfection. It was very timely today, as we mentioned, given the federal money that was put into our own treatment here in Ottawa. And so it was an interesting jumping off point for that conversation. But as Dr. Ormeci pointed out, there's a lot of work still to be done in a lot of issues. And one of the points that she made on the show today that seems to have struck a chord with a lot of listeners is the idea of how we pay attention to some of the issues that are hidden from us. The wastewater treatment centers are not like a bridge. They're not like the center point of high architecture that people are paying attention to. And I think in a lot of her work, including most recently with the UNESCO book, where they had different people from all around the world painting a portrait of where we're at with water in countries around the world, she was chosen to reflect on Canada. Even within Canada, there's disparity from place to place as to how well we're doing, so to speak. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Banu Ormeci.
Thanks everyone for coming here. As you see, I brought my tap water with me. I don't drink bottled water because tap water is safe. So today I'm going to give you an overview on water and wastewater treatment technologies that we use for treating drinking water and wastewater, and also how well we're doing in Canada as well as in Ottawa. So Canada, the image we have, Canada has lots of water. Yes, that is correct. We do have access to 1/5 of the world's stock of surface water, but it doesn't mean that we do not have water shortages. And there are many reasons for that. First of all, existing water does not mean renewable water. And if you look at the distribution of our population, more than 95% of us live in southern Canada. And if you look at the water sources, Canada's water flows north to Arctic or subarctic regions. And so we do not necessarily have all of that water in the southern Canada in places where we live. So that does create water shortages. And as you can see in the map, southern Saskatchewan, southern Manitoba, and also around the Great Lakes areas, now we do experience water shortages. And another important point here is to emphasize the importance of protecting water quality. Once we contaminate, pollute our surface waters, it's very difficult to treat them. And pollution obviously is a growing problem because of the oil sands and the industry and the increasing population. So there's lots of stresses put on our water resources. So this is a nice picture. I really like using this picture in my presentations. And then let's assume this is Ottawa. So yes, we do have the Ottawa River, and how drinking water and wastewater treatment works is first we take our drinking water from the Ottawa River that goes to a water treatment plant, which treats the river water, makes it drinking water, and then through a pipe network, it is distributed to the homes. And it is used at homes, it becomes wastewater, and then there's another pipe network that collects that wastewater, takes it to the wastewater treatment plant, and note that wastewater treatment plant is completely separate from drinking water treatment plant, and after that it is discharged back into the Ottawa River. So it is very important to understand that cycle. You know, we take our drinking water from Ottawa River and then we discharge our wastewater effluents to the Ottawa River as well. So it is very, very important to do a very good job on wastewater treatment. And typically what happens is all the emphasis is on drinking water, safe drinking water, providing safe drinking water. But if you're not doing a good job on wastewater treatment, there's really not much point to treating water because it just makes it very, very expensive. And the right way to do this is to deal with pollution at its source. So that's right at the discharge of wastewater treatment. So for those of you who are not familiar with how water treatment, wastewater treatment works, I'll just give you a little bit of introduction so I can to lead you to the next slides. So this is our drinking water treatment system in Ottawa at the Britannia drinking water treatment plant. So drinking water treatment is quite straightforward compared to wastewater treatment. The reason for that is there is organic matter and some silt and particles, and what we really do is to first flocculate those smaller particles, make them bigger, and so when they're bigger, they're heavier. We can remove them through sedimentation, and then we do have a filters to remove some of those smaller particles, some of those pathogens, might provide some additional treatment, and then we disinfect it and then pump it to the city. Wastewater treatment, on the other hand, is much more complex. The reason for that is there are lots of different chemicals, some toxic compounds maybe. And so wastewater treatment is a combination of physical treatment processes, and we typically call them primary treatment, and then biological treatment. We call it secondary treatment. Biological treatment removes organic matter. We use microorganisms to achieve that. And then after that, some treatment plants have tertiary treatment. So these are advanced treatment processes that can also remove nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And removing nutrients is important because, as you know, they cause eutrophication, especially in lakes, algae blooms. But as you can see, wastewater treatment is much more complex than drinking water treatment. And at the very least, you should be doing primary treatment and biological treatment. So the next slide is from an Environment Canada report, and it does show where we take our drinking water in different provinces. And as you see, most of our drinking water, except Prince Edward Island, comes from surface water. And the reason I would like to highlight this is, again, the importance of protecting our water supplies. If we contaminate our surface waters, we're basically contaminating our drinking water. If we look at the wastewater treatment, and this is where we're not doing such a great job in Canada, or we were not doing a very good job, I would say, until recently. So what you see here is the blue bars is either no treatment whatsoever or very preliminary treatment. And then the dashed blue bars is primary treatment, which is basically the simple settling processes. That's not real wastewater treatment. The pink bars that you see is for secondary treatment, so that is the minimum that we should be employing at our treatment plants. And after that, the dark blue line is the tertiary treatment, which is one level higher treatment of wastewater. So as you see, I mean, there are places, understandably, especially in upper north colder regions, some places they do not have much wastewater treatment at all. But if we look at, for example, Quebec or even British Columbia, the blue bars, I mean, there's still like 40%, 45% of wastewater that does not receive any real treatment and just discharge to surface waters. In Ontario, Manitoba, we are doing well, meaning we do have at least biological treatment. That is the minimum level of treatment. But who is really doing very well in Canada? That is Alberta and Saskatchewan, because those are the provinces that they employ a lot of tertiary treatment in their wastewater treatment plants. So we should also look at our Aboriginal communities. And in Canada, yes, we are a rich country. Overall, Canadians enjoy a high quality of drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. But we do experience challenges as well. And the remoteness of some communities, as well as the cold climate conditions, do present additional challenges. So the colorful dots here, the red dots, so this is for Aboriginal communities. This is from a recent report from 2011. And the red dots are the high-risk communities in terms of drinking water. The yellow dots are the medium risk, and the green dots are the low-risk drinking water systems. And the dots are spread across Canada equally, which shows that it's not just one or two provinces that have this problem. We do have this problem across Canada. But if you look at the percentage of the red dots, it's approximately 45% of all Aboriginal communities. So they are high-risk systems. 35% are the medium risk systems, and the other 25% is the low risk system. So there's still things that we need to do better in Canada. There is a game changer, and that is the recent standards on wastewater treatment and discharges. And since 2012, we do now have federal standards for treatment of wastewater. And what that achieves is to bring a minimum level of wastewater treatment across Canada. So one of the points that the regulation is criticized is the long rollout time. So if you are a high-risk system, you still have until 2020 for compliance. If it is a low-risk system, until 2040, so that's a pretty long time. But at least we do have something now. But if we compare these standards to the standards in US or in Europe, they're not as stringent. We do not have any limits on fecal coliform, E. coli, or pathogenic bacteria, and we do not have any limits on phosphorus either. So again, if we focus back to Ottawa, we do have 2 drinking water treatment plants. And then for the rural parts, there are 5 groundwater well systems. And then we do have 1 big wastewater treatment plant, which is ROPEC. Our treatment plants, they do a very good job in treating drinking water and wastewater. They are very well operated. But if you compare the engineering processes, they're kind of on the basic side. Okay, so there isn't really anything leading edge, novelty. It's not like seeing treatment plants in Europe or in US. So they're basic, but they do their job. But what is important to highlight here is that both our drinking water and wastewater, they do meet all of the federal provincial guidelines and standards. So the drinking water is safe, tap water is safe. I do get these questions a lot, and I've given lots of talks on bottled water versus tap water. And I just checked the 2014 report on the drinking water status in Ottawa, and there wasn't, at the Britannia water treatment plant, there wasn't even one case where they exceeded the required guidelines or standards. So that is good news. And I will also mention another thing, and I saw this when I was trying to find that report, you Google. And your municipality, your municipalities, plural, across Canada, they do their best and they do a good job. But what they cannot do, because they don't have the money for that, they cannot advertise their product. So again, bringing this to bottled water, remember that bottled water companies, they're Pepsi, they're Coke, they spend billions of dollars on advertising their product, that you drink a bottle of water and you look like Jennifer Aniston, health, beauty, youth, all of that. And I've seen some reports from a local company that market home-based water treatment systems. And I read what they put out, and I wondered if this is even legal. All these, how do you make people to buy your product? You just scare them. And then they write this stuff that sounds scientific. There's no references to any scientific papers or reports, but then at the very end they say, oh, by the way, all of this information has been compiled from reports from Health Canada, Environment Canada, etc., which is just wrong. And so there is lots of that out there as well. And the bottom line is your drinking water is safe. So, but it doesn't mean that things cannot be better. We need to invest in our water and wastewater infrastructure, and I prepared this slide before I knew about today's announcement. So there is great news now. We do have $155 million to build underground storage facilities to handle combined sewer overflows. But, this is not a new thing. Water and wastewater infrastructure has traditionally been underfunded. And when I say infrastructure, it's not just treatment, but it's also collection and distribution systems. And it does make most sense to control pollution at its source. So it's not just treating drinking water, but maybe treating wastewater is more important, or at least is as important as treating drinking water. We need to move towards more advanced water and wastewater treatment technologies, and these are not very expensive, or many other treatment plants are doing this, and particularly because of the concerns with emerging contaminants, pharmaceutical compounds that Chris mentioned, there are simple ways such as ozonation, advanced oxidation processes or membranes that can take out these compounds from treated wastewater or from drinking water. And public education and involvement is also very important, and I'll tell you that Ottawa is doing a very poor job on this. 10 years ago, they were saying, they have budget cuts. You cannot have tours of the treatment plants, and I guess this is why some of this misinformation is out there. I cannot even take my engineering students to the treatment plant to see what it looks like, so definitely I think Ottawa is missing the train on that, especially when I go to Europe and US, how they involve kids from elementary school. Every year they go to a facility operated by the city, such as water treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant, landfill, and they see it, they know it, they understand it, and they are involved and they protect these systems. They know not to dump pharmaceuticals down the drain. They do have the information and knowledge as well. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ormeci. Finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Emeritus from the University of Waterloo, recently retired Associate Professor and Chair Department of Environment and Resource Studies. A man who combines interests of climate and society, along with the assessment of impact on especially water resources, and what I like the phrase that they used, the implications of living with climatic uncertainty. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Paul Kay.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, and thank you to RCI for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for being here. I'll get to the slide in a minute. I'm going to talk about a few aspects of our relationship to water, and perhaps the meaning of water for us. If we think about our approaches to water issues, we see we have to deal with three stressors. First, we need to be able to accommodate growing populations that have growing demands for water uses. Second, we need to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. And third, we need to maintain ecological services in a healthy environment. Put together, these all suggest that we need to be both efficient in our use of water and conservative of our water resources. As David has indicated, the soft path approach offers new ways not only to find efficiencies, but also to reduce our overall use of water. There's an unanswered question underlying the emphasis on water use efficiency. Does efficiency actually lead to or produce conservation? The answer would seem to be an obvious yes, and many of our long-term demand management strategies assume it. But the reality is that it may not be so. In the mid-19th century, the English economist William Stanley Jevons argued that improved efficiency of use of energy from coal, due to improved technologies, paradoxically led to increased total consumption of coal. The American designer and thinker about sustainability, William McDonough, has said, "Just because you are less bad doesn't mean you are good. It means only that you are less bad." That is, we need different ways of thinking about sustainability. Is efficiency merely the less bad when the good that we seek and need is conservation? Does the Jevons paradox hold for water? The Swedish medical statistician Hans Rowling has a wonderful website and program called Gapminder. The Gapminder project contains some data that might suggest an answer. So this schematic suggests that if efficiency does produce conservation, we would expect a time series graph with total resource use on the vertical axis, increasing upwards, and efficiency on the horizontal axis. Efficiency will be greater as the number is less, so efficiency gets larger to the left. This time series would display a trend line oriented from upper left to lower right over time. If I use per capita water withdrawal as a measure of efficiency, and total water withdrawal as a measure of total resource use, the data for Canada look like this, that improved efficiency has been associated with increased, not decreased, use of water. That's the opposite of the trend we want, and it does seem to suggest that we're living in a Jevons paradox in Canada. Not all countries look like this, but Canada certainly does. Now, there are many questions about this graph and the data under it. How complete and of what quality are the data? They are UN FAO data, but we're still not sure about how good they are. What is going on within water use sectors? What is going on regionally and locally within Canada? As the Canada-wide soft path study has suggested, aggregated data and particularly national level data are not the appropriate scales to be looking at. We need to be looking at more local situations. However, the trend shown here should give us pause about our relationship to water. Now, we do think of water differently than we do of other resources that are mined. The idea of the water cycle, constantly bringing water back to our rivers and lakes via evaporation and precipitation, is a firmly entrenched idea. It's a firmly entrenched belief, if we follow Jamie Linton's thinking. Yet we can deplete groundwater resources using them up faster than they are naturally replenished. We can render flowing surface waters unusable for numerous desired purposes by our pollution. In effect, we break the hydrologic cycle and we are mining water. If we know this, and if we know that we shouldn't act this way, why do we persist? This is perhaps the most difficult question facing those of us trying to promote pro-environmental behavior. Perhaps it's that we moderns trust rational science and we believe that human ingenuity will always find technological solutions. So, as we've heard, we've had physics and chemistry and engineering that provide us here in Canada with basically uninterrupted safe drinking water and sewage treatment. And we're glad that in most parts of Canada that that's the case. And we do have some remarkable examples of the contribution of efficiency in demand management that seem to counter this Jevons paradox. For example, when I came to Waterloo in the early 1990s, planners were already anticipating, or had been anticipating for quite a while, the imminent need for a very large pipe to pump water from Lake Erie uphill to the region of Waterloo, because they foresaw a depletion of the aquifers upon which the region is dependent. Yet 2 decades of education, suasion, and economic incentives have resulted in pushing off the necessity for such an expensive project, currently estimated at in excess of $1 billion just to build, until the middle part of the century or even later. These are data for about a 5 or 6 year period from the most recent water efficiency master plan for the region of Waterloo. And it shows a 14% drop in total per capita demand in recent years. Multifamily residences and in industry, commercial, and institutional sectors show similar kinds of trends. And a survey done in conjunction with that water efficiency master plan showed that 98% of the residents thought water conservation was important or very important. Free or low-cost rain barrels, rebates for replacing toilets and other water-using appliances with high-efficiency models, emphasis on xeriscaping, enforcement on summer lawn watering policies and bans, revision of the pricing structure, all have effected this positive result. Note how many of these measures are based on economic rationality. Economists' model and demand management measures are based on the assumption that we are rational beings and we make choices that are in our economic best interest. It's really only a matter of making efficiency and conservation measures economical. That may not be so easy, though. One of our students at Waterloo, Jenna Dish, looked at the preparedness thinking of the low water response team on the Grand River. She found that there was a lack of agreement among the members of that team over which water services were important to protect under different climate change-induced stresses. Ecosystem services were hardly recognized by members of the team. The team is made up of representatives from local and regional government and from the different water use sectors. If economic self-interest is at play, it's restrictive rather than all-encompassing of the common weal. I suggest that we need to allow for the irrational in our planning and management. And by that I mean we need to understand that people also operate and make choices based on beliefs and perceptions and yes, even fears. If we are enlightened, we acknowledge that First Nations have a special spiritual relationship to water. But rational analysts find this difficult to model and give it bare lip service. But let me cite work of a couple of my colleagues at Waterloo to illustrate the kind of thinking about our relationship to water from a behavioral point of view. Our student Sarah Anderson has wisely recognized that many immigrants and new Canadians come from environments and cultures with very different experiences of and approaches to water supply and use. She is collecting stories from such people in the Waterloo region to illustrate the variety of knowledges represented in our multi-ethnic society. They are telling her about their both personal and community meanings of water that they are not finding in Canada. The usual form of public consultation on large projects does not seem to substitute for the social function once provided by meeting at the communal well. This kind of information should be recognized by institutional water managers and planners as they design conservation strategies and social marketing mechanisms to try to promote conservation. My colleague, Professor Sarah Wolf, and her students are utilizing concepts from psychology that suggest that our choices, which have environmental consequences, may be consciously or even unconsciously conditioned by our sense of our own mortality. It is not only a case of a prior experience, such as a drought-induced interruption of supply, that affect belief about the future probability of occurrence of another drought or the potential impact. Unrelated prompts suggesting mortality can also be influential in how people think about water. Once religions provided us a buffer against the terror of mortality, such as with the promise of divine reward in an afterlife. Rational modernity, we've given that up. So people look to a couple places to try to soften the fear, the terror of our own mortality. One of these is called hero projects. It's creating something large that will last beyond us to provide some reassurance that our fame will last longer than us. For example, the choice to build large infrastructure may in part be motivated by the desire to leave something behind to attest to one's own existence. Actually, this is a motive as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Sarah and her student were looking at the Hoover Dam as their example, but I think this example in Toronto, the R.C. Harris water treatment plant, is also a good example. Did R.C. Harris, who was the Commissioner of Public Works in Toronto in the 20s and 30s, did he really have to build such a grand monument in Art Deco style for this water treatment plant to do its job and provide good lake water to the city? Harris wanted his hero project. It's a beautiful building, and when it's open, on doors open, it's a wonderful place to go tour. Another response, again, either conscious or unconscious, to managing the terror of mortality may be material spending. This has been documented in numerous studies in environmental psychology. People want to buy more. The implications for sustainability are not particularly favorable. More resource use leads to environmental degradation, leads to proximity of death, or at least major deterioration of lifestyle, leads to more buying and more materiality to buffer against the fear, leads to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In sum, I am not suggesting a neither-or situation. I'm not suggesting a choice between rational science and economics on the one hand and irrational belief on the other. Rather, I think including both, and I think it's the belief systems and the human side of the story that is not well represented in our planning and thinking, that this will widen our consideration of what leads us to the choices we make, and it should give us a more robust understanding for development of effective management and governance. Thank you.
Thanks to all the panelists for very different perspectives on the future of water. If I could now get the panelists to move to the equally glamorous wooden chairs that are at the front of the building, at the front of the room. We have, I'm just checking where we're at for time. I do have one question that I could just open it up with to all of you, because I'm happy to play Oprah and start running into the audience if need be. But, we've already got an Oprah running through the audience. Excellent. I appreciate that. But one of the things that I was noticing throughout your discussions is, and I mean, of course, this was driven home especially with what Dr. K was saying at the end of how you change behavior. But I wondered for each of you what role you think government plays in achieving that change. We seem to always be caught between this idea of whether it should be the person making changes in their own life and what they're consuming and how we're living our lives versus the idea of a larger force coming down and saying, it is time for you to make a change by doing X. And we heard about the restrictive demand that was in Dr. Brooks' presentation, Dr. Ormeci talking about where the resources were actually spent, the idea of reducing the levels of compounds that Dr. Metcalfe talked about. So I wondered if each of you could just briefly say one thing that you think, perhaps it's easiest to talk about at a federal level, that would affect the kind of change that you'd like to see. I'll start with Dr. Brooks.
Well, I hate to say it, but I think the most effective thing that we could do is to get our water pricing. We don't even pay with our sufficiently to run the treatment plants. So I think that people do react to prices, and it would be a substantial price increase. And if you pushed me down to one single thing, that would be the most effective.
So there is a need for more public involvement, education, but also, so it's great to encourage people, but it's also very important to have the strict regulations to force treatment plants, municipalities to do what they should be doing. Without regulations, there's just no enforcement and things will not be done.
And when you're saying strict regulations, what kinds of things would you like to see?
So if it is the protection of water supplies, then there should be strict standards about discharges, that a higher level of wastewater treatment should be required from everyone.
With penalties that go with that.
Exactly. And so, like, I did my PhD in US, so it's very interesting to see the difference between US and Canada. And EPA is a real force in the US, and the treatment plants are really scared because the fines are like $300,000 a day.
Right.
So, they don't want to be out of compliance for a week because it does cost them a lot of money. So they do take the steps in advance just to make sure that they are going to be okay.
And why do you think we don't have that here?
Oh, Canada is more complicated. All the, territories, provinces, and Aboriginal communities. Maybe it's more difficult to come up with standards that can apply to everyone in a fair way.
Dr. Metcalfe.
I'm trying to imagine a black market in underarm deodorant as a result of the banning of. So I don't think that's going to work. Where government, I think, can help is around public education. As I said, the David Suzuki Foundation is already doing some of that, but that's a website-based kind of message that's getting out. So if you got, through media, if there was some sort of public education process around the fact that we should be more careful about what we're putting down the drain, I think that might be helpful. But ultimately, I think it's it's the responsibility of the consumers to be responsible for their consumer choices, and what the various levels of government can do are probably not great. Having said that, I think around disposing of drugs properly, I think every municipality should have some sort of drug disposal program similar to Blue Block's program or other recycling. So I think municipalities have a place there.
What about how the drugs get approved, though? I mean, is the damage to the environment, is that taken into account when the drugs are being approved in Canada?
So in Europe, there is a risk assessment process which is put in place around approvals for drugs. We have a fledgling system here in Canada. Health Canada and Environment Canada do take a look at that. What's kind of interesting in Sweden, they're running there's actually an NGO that runs a campaign in which they put leaflets in pharmacies and in doctors' offices, which inform the public about if you have a choice between different types of drugs, which one would be the better one in terms of the environment. So that's kind of an interesting process that's taking place there.
So you asked specifically about the role of government. So I agree with the role of government probably is in getting the pricing correct, setting standards, and enforcement regimes for that, enforcing truth in advertising claims. But mostly I think it has to be from people. For government, I guess I would conclude, don't muzzle scientists and don't destroy data.
Yeah. Are there questions from the audience? People would like to go. Do you want me to head over there? Is that easier? Do you think you got it? Okay.
Yeah, a few comments. Brooks noted that 80% of the water is used for irrigation. Banu Ormeci talked about nitrogen and phosphorus. South Nation watershed has 95 and 98% of its nitrogen and phosphorus coming from agriculture. Antibiotics, hormones are used in agriculture. So I guess I'm targeting the three of you. The issue there is certainly agricultural. And by the way, as a comment, I do agree with Brooks. If you double the price of gas, I'll probably drive about half as far as I do. That's pretty simple economics. And if the public is not aware of the issues, and I don't believe on the whole they are, that we're not going to see any change. But the more primary focus of my point is the agricultural issue with respect to water, its consumption and its quality.
Dr. Brooks, do you want to start?
Well, I will admit that agriculture is always the most difficult to deal with because it's an enormous range of sizes, of types of farms, of how they can operate, and so forth. It's very hard to generalize about agriculture. Nevertheless, I think the best examples are occurring in Manitoba and in Ontario, where there are conservation authorities with different levels of power, and they focus a lot of their attention on agriculture, and because that's the source. I've forgotten what. I forgot, was one of us anyway, not, other than I, so mentioned that go after the source, and they can see that that's the source of their problem, and they're down at a local level, and they can operate on a first name basis with farmers doing different things at different times, and so I think you can get at agriculture. The big ones I worry about are in the West, when they got huge rights to huge volumes of water, when Canada was trying to make sure that they populated the West so that those people from south of the border didn't stream in and annex part of that land to the United States. So and they operate on a use it or lose it basis. So I have been out in Alberta and Saskatchewan in pouring rain when the irrigation systems are operating, which is because they might as well use it. Otherwise they're going to lose it. Anyway, that's.
Is there something you want? No?
Well, I think one of the big problems, and you mentioned in South Nation watershed, is that for municipalities who are spending millions of dollars to upgrade their wastewater treatment plants, and they have a legitimate argument when they say, well, okay, we're spending all this money in the municipality to reduce our phosphorus loadings into the receiving water. What are they doing upstream, the farmers, et cetera? And I think we have to get better data. I think we have to, as you said, get information on. Yeah, we have the data.
It's 95 or 98.
Yeah.
It's 100% of fossil fuel
Yeah.
any of
Yeah.
Results in a 0.01% improvement
Mm-hmm.
in your water situation.
Yeah.
And there's the antibiotics.
Yep. Yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. Obviously, I think there has to be better enforcement of best farming practices, best management practices. Buffer strips, all the regular stuff, no-till farming, all those kinds of things that we can do to try to reduce the discharge from non-point sources like agriculture.
and and the fertilizers and pesticides, and they end up in runoff water, and so that is it's not just wastewater discharges, but there are additional large sources, and it does very much depend on the size of the farm as well. But right, those, I mean, it's easier to deal with point sources, but then what do you do with these like huge number of smaller sources of pollution? And that's a problem.
There was
Go after
another-
the industry.
There was another hand up at the back, I think. Yeah. Go ahead.
Ontario, or rather the province, says that water is a resource, so it's their responsibility. How difficult it is for the federal government to put a minimum of pollution allowed into any body of water across Canada? And do other countries have federal laws dealing with pollution allowed in the waters?
The federal government could, if it wanted to assert its role, deal with any body of water that flows across or under, along a border. So there's no reason now that, in effect, the federal government has just refused to accept responsibilities that it could have. We sort of peaked with the Pierce report in 1987, and the government has receded. It's done less and less on water ever since. But the specific answer to your question, if it's transborder, or if you want to take the Fisheries Act, it said that this law applied to any water in which fish live, or that flows into a body of water where fish live. That covers just about every river, every stream, every rivulet, anywhere, and they took it as until it was emasculated by the Harper government in I think it was the last omnibus bill, or maybe it's the previous omnibus bill.
Yes.
You want to go here?
That's all right, I have a teacher voice. It's okay. You got it. Well, we're going to If, as you all suggested, that a great deal of the responsibility lies with individuals, how would you suggest that the individuals, including through the use of the media and schools and so on, receive and transmit and get involved in understanding and doing something about this? I mean, I had this pipe dream that, along with the stock market report on all of those little news lines, that we should have an ozone layer report or a water saved report or something like that. But, I mean, really, how do we get it?
I do know examples of other countries where water is scarce and there are daily reports in the papers of reservoir levels or water use or so on. I guess the bigger picture is through education, and it's always from primary education up. Teach the kids, and they come home and ask their parents why they're doing something this way and that way, as opposed to the way they've been taught or talked about in school. Unfortunately, that's going to take a generation, at least.
But is it the types of programs that she's referring to there, where you would, for instance, is it through mass media that you get those ideas across to kids, or are we talking about actually part of the education curriculum? I just.
Your responsibility in the media. I mean,
Oh no, the media never has a responsibility. That's
you still want people to listen to you and not be so bummed out that they don't listen.
right. Oh no, we're okay with people being bummed out. That's basically all of our listeners right now.
What I was suggesting was formal education, but the schools, I guess camps, anytime you've got that kind of educational work going on, and don't know how to reach us old people to have us change our ways. We're old dogs and can't learn the new tricks, but the kids certainly can. I'm glad to hear other ideas.
I think that's also related to the resources issue. It's not that municipalities or treatment plants do not want to be involved in educating public, starting with kids from elementary school to maybe social media, but they simply do not have the resources for this. And I know this from Ottawa. They did stop all treatment plant tours 10 years ago. And basically their difficulties look like we have a minimum number of operators. We can hardly keep up with operating the treatment plant. We just don't have these additional personnel to give you guys tours. So that's their point. But what I also see is when treatment plants or municipalities, there is a big issue, they're desperate, then they are very good in pulling their resources and reaching out. And the last more recent example of this is these supposedly flushable wet wipes, which they're not flushable, they do not decompose, they do not biodegrade, so they cause lots of problems in the collection system as well as in the treatment system. And suddenly I look at it as lots of information there at every meeting, so when they really want to do it or when they have to do it, they do it. But one of the problems is just the lack of resources for these activities.
I don't think we should be afraid to use symbolism. I know I kind of downplayed the hazards associated with contaminants in drinking water, but as I explained to regulators who kind of go, yeah, we shouldn't worry about those things, people don't like the idea of cocaine being in their drinking water. Right? Why shouldn't we use that as a symbolism for how we are affecting the quality of our drinking water? Outside of the potential hazards, I think you can't be. There's truth in advertising. You can't take that too far. But I don't think we should shy away from the fact that there is a symbolism about the purity of our water that we have in Canada, and we're all proud of, and the fact that we're doing a bad job at protecting it.
Although I guess that could end up playing into the hand of what Dr. Ormeci was talking about earlier, about when a company that's selling water can then use those same images to claim that that's the only way of.
Let me just add, there are models. You can look at what York Region did when it was faced with the need. They could see 10 or 15 years from now that they would need more water. What are their alternatives? And they went through a very extensive project of bringing people in, discussing it, going through alternatives, and so forth. And the second model, I would say, is the, I think it's called the Capital Region Project in British Columbia, where, again, very active participation of communities. And I wouldn't say they came up with a water soft path, but they certainly came up with a low water alternative to what they have now.
Now, Hella, I'm just making sure. Did you want to now one more question, and then we move to the networking outside? So whoever's the lucky person with the mic, go for it.
Thank you. We heard about agriculture. We heard about efforts being made by communities. We didn't heard very much about what's happening globally, the glaciers, the fracking to get more petroleum. I was earlier this morning in front of the courthouse questioning journalism. Excuse my accent, my first language is French. And I was asking them what they know about glaciers. Well, they said the usual answer. Glaciers are melting. They are feeding rivers. but they couldn't tell one major problem that arose recently, and that was highlighted by scientists. That glaciers, many glaciers do not regenerate anymore. So I would like to hear from you about glaciers.
Well, it's a real problem, particularly for farmers on the prairies. There is almost no water that comes from Saskatchewan and Manitoba, except for eastern Manitoba. The water all comes from the glaciers. Yeah. And the advantage of the glaciers in their before we had significant warming was that the water came late in the year. It didn't melt early, it melted late. So the farmers don't basically need water right after a winter. You've got all that snow on top that is providing plenty of what's called green water, that is the water in the soil, which is what's active and allows you to grow things without irrigation. But by the end of the summer, that water has all been depleted, and if the glaciers flow, then it's an enormous benefit. But they're not doing that anymore. They're just adding on to a time when the water is already sufficient. So that's whatever. Yeah, the glaciers are not receding. I'm sorry, the glaciers are receding. They are not replenishing. They're no longer a renewable resource.
So I'll just add a few sentences to that. So that was an excellent point. So recently I wrote a book chapter for Canada, and Neal mentioned that, and part of that book chapter was the effect of climate change on the water resources in Canada. And now there's lots of data available that shows that losing the glaciers, it does cause flooding in some regions, and it does cause droughts in some regions. So we are already seeing the impact of that in Canada, and it's not like future, it's going to happen. No, they are melting, we already know that, but we are also seeing the environmental impact of that in Canada. And there's some excellent reports on that.
You asked what's happening globally. So the UN estimates that by 2030, 1/3 of the world's population will be what they call water poor. This will exacerbate the gap between the rich and the poor. In rich countries, they will be able to use technologies such as desalinization of water, treatment of water, toilet to tap, reuse of water. That will happen in 2017 in San Diego. 1/3 of their water will be recycled wastewater by that time. So those kinds of reuse technologies, desalinization, will be used in developed countries such as the United States and Canada. But what will happen to those countries that cannot afford those types of technologies? They will be water poor. So that is the predictions for the future in a global context.
So on that note, this was a perfect lead-in for me to say that that's actually going to be the subject of the talks in Calgary. So you may not have been here earlier, but is our drinking water at risk? We're moving from Ottawa to Calgary, and Calgary is implicated. Its drinking water is affected by the glaciers. So if you go online after we finish our Calgary talk, you'll be able to watch it online. So I'd like to first thank Alan for moderating so effectively and efficiently. A gift.
Thank you.
And you can accept it, it's not a problem.
Okay, yes.
Okay. And I'd also like to thank our panelists who brought 4 different perspectives to you. And now you can answer the question among yourselves, is our drinking water at risk? So you can maybe join them out there for some popcorn and chips and a drink and talk to them for a little bit more. And I'd like to just thank each one of them. David, Paul, Banu, and Chris. Thank you. And thank you all for coming out. So join us out there with our scientists to have a snack.